Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew Jagman. I'm an exercise physiologist in the sports medicine department at Mayo Clinic Health System. Today, I'll be presenting on the validity and reliability of fitness watches for determining heart rate and energy expenditure. In this presentation, we're going to first discuss fitness watches, what these devices are, what they can measure. Then we'll get into why I think it's important to evaluate heart rate and energy expenditure with these devices. And then lastly, we'll get into some of the validity and reliability to determine how accurate these devices actually are at measuring some of the things they're marketed to do. If we look at the economic impact of these devices and wearable technologies as a whole, this is a rapidly growing field with estimates of the economic impact to grow from 31 billion upwards to 80 billion within the next decade. A lot of this growth is driven by advances in some of the technology that's used in these devices, in addition to the applications that we're starting to see in both the fitness and health space, but then now also transitioning into the clinical applications of these devices for potentially even remote patient monitoring capabilities. And so really the future of these devices and how they're going to be used is limitless, and this could have both good and bad implications in terms of how these devices are used and what we can kind of glean from the information that we can derive from these devices. If we also look at the research on these devices, we also see similar upwards trends, which is good. That means we're trying to better understand these devices. Are they accurate? Do they give us the type of information that they're marketed for and are intended to use, both in research and clinical and consumer type applications? And so if we, again, look at the trends here, you can see over the last decade or so, we see a significant rise in the number of studies that are being published with different wearable devices, with a specific focus on a lot of the different fitness watches that we see kind of on the consumer market. Some of the information or parameters that I personally am more interested in, and we also see this in the literature as well, is looking at how accurate these fitness watches are when measuring heart rate and energy expenditure. And so heart rate is typically measured by a light-specific measurement known as PPG that allows for kind of an indirect estimate of heart rate that can be calculated or estimated at the wrist level from some of these different wearable devices. Whereas the energy expenditure estimates are typically estimated from more movement-based estimates, just based on how that accelerometer is kind of indicating general movement. Some of the devices will also incorporate other information such as demographics or heart rate-based influences that may kind of alter the actual calculation of energy expenditure. And so you might be wondering why these are important to kind of focus on or evaluate with these devices. Well, both of them can measure kind of individualized measures of physical activity. So heart rate gives us an indication of kind of relative intensity of effort during different activities, whereas energy expenditure, especially when expressed over a 24-hour period, gives us more of a volume-based measure of physical activity. So how much work is actually being completed by that user, again, throughout a 24-hour period. And then I'm sure most people are aware, but a lot of devices now are starting to measure and provide values that represent a whole host of different lifestyle, recovery, sleep-based parameters. And again, we could spend days kind of talking about all the different types of information that a lot of these devices at least claim to be measuring. But again, we're mostly focusing on the heart rate and energy expenditure aspects of these different devices. And so if we look at some of the specific study designs typically used to evaluate the accuracy of these devices, generally you'll see a whole list of different wearable devices or fitness watches typically compared against some kind of criterion measure. The most common tends to be some kind of EKG type unit to again measure or compare what we would consider an indirect measure of heart rate that we get from a fitness watch versus more of a direct measure of heart rate from those EKG criterion measurement tools. Similarly, on the energy expenditure side, we often will compare the energy expenditure estimated from a fitness watch to a more gold standard or criterion measure. Typically, that's going to be indirect calorimetry that we see in most laboratory-based settings. And then usually they'll evaluate the accuracy of these devices during a variety of different exercise protocols or free living types of activities, sometimes in lab controlled situations or settings versus, again, more free living kind of ambulatory type conditions or activities. So our group in particular studied the accuracy of 2 fitness watches and a chest strap based device compared to what we use for criterion measures in And again, that was EKG in that and that indirect calorimetry device that I mentioned on the previous slide. And so we had our participants complete a standardized exercise protocol, and then we had the participants wearing all these different devices throughout that graded exercise protocol. And then we were able to evaluate how accurate the fitness watches and that chest strap were at providing estimates of heart rate and energy expenditure. And so what we found with our results from this particular study is when we looked at that mean absolute percentage error, which gives us an indication of how accurate these devices are when predicting some of the actual measurements collected from the criterion measures, you can see the fitness watches here were off for anywhere from 15 to 17 beats per minute, which corresponded to about 11% error rate, whereas the chest strap was a little bit more accurate, was only off by about 7 beats per minute, and that converted to about a 6% error rate. So most of the devices, or excuse me, all of the devices in this particular study underestimated heart rate, which is a pretty consistent finding that we see across the literature. And then in this particular study, again, the device with the highest level of accuracy or agreement was actually the chest strap. So what we can interpret from this is that if you get a chest strap device that can measure heart rate, that tends to be a little bit more accurate than what we see from some of our wrist-based fitness watches or measurement tools. And we'll come back to this a little bit later. When we look at the energy expenditure findings, somewhat similar error rate, so anywhere from about 9 to 13% of a prediction error is what we found in this particular study during that exercise protocol. In this situation, the Fitbit actually had the lowest error, which is a little bit counter to our initial hypothesis, because this was one of the wrist-based fitness watches, and it actually ended up being a little bit more accurate for estimating energy expenditure, even though we knew the chest strap was providing a more accurate heart rate measurement. And so when we compare our findings to others across the literature, we typically see fairly high levels of correlation when we look at heart rate values collected from fitness watches, again, compared to some of the criterion measures. I would say the more common trends are an underestimation of heart rate, particularly as we transition from our moderate to vigorous levels of activity or exercise intensity. And then unfortunately with the error ranges or error rates, we tend to see anywhere from 10 to 30 beats per minute, which could correspond to anywhere from 5 to 15% of an error rate. So they do tend to perform better during lower levels of exercise intensity, and then also during more steady state forms of physical activity or exercise, such as cardiovascular exercise and activities. The reliability also tends to be fairly strong with these devices, with the exception of decreased reliability measures when we, again, transition from moderate to more higher intensity-based activities, and then also when we start incorporating more dynamic or varied movement patterns that really involve a variety of different arm-based motions and activities. There also can be some variabilities with different skin tones, again, fit on the wrist itself, and then also some general movement artifact that we see. And again, when we compare this to the energy expenditure literature, or what we see from these particular studies, somewhat similar trends where we actually see some of those higher error rates present themselves during some of the more varied movements and activities that we tend to observe in more of our free living kind of daily activities of living. And then that error rate tends to go up again when we see more varied forms of movement, and then also ones done at higher intensities. And we don't really see a consistent trend in terms of whether or not accelerometer only versus heart rate incorporated measures of exercise intensity are more accurate from one to the other. There really isn't any kind of consistent findings that we see across the literature, so we can't necessarily point to one measurement technique or prediction model where that tends to be the most accurate when providing an estimate of energy expenditure. Again, it tends to be quite varied and rather inconsistent across the literature. And so this has been seen again across a variety of different fitness watches and different models, in which we typically see those error rates anywhere from the mid-teens upwards to 20 to 30%, with some estimates as high as 40% of an error rate when looking at how accurate these devices are when trying to provide an estimate of energy expenditure. And again, during more lighter activities or moderate, they actually tend to overestimate energy expenditure. And then as we get into the higher levels of exercise intensity, there we actually see an underestimation of energy expenditure. So again, it's unfortunately not really consistent across the levels of exercise intensity. And so we can't necessarily consistently provide any kind of correction factors or ways where we can accommodate these different error rates or inconsistencies. It's just kind of the nature of what we see across these different models and devices. So again, there's substantial levels of inter-device variability that we see from one watch to the next. So again, unfortunately, we're not able to consistently determine that all watches would underestimate versus overestimate energy expenditure. It really depends on the specific device that we're evaluating and using, either in research or clinical practice, when we kind of provide information back to patients, clients, participants, in terms of how they can interpret the values that are collected from these different devices. And then in general, we tend to see that error rate anywhere from about 20 to 30. And as I said earlier, it could be upwards to 40% of an error rate when we look at how accurate these devices can be when providing some of those estimates of energy expenditure. And so when we kind of take this all together, a lot of these devices really aren't equivalent to one another, even though they're all kind of measuring a lot of the same parameters, whether it's heart rate or energy expenditure. A lot of them are, again, unfortunately, not consistently able to determine accurate measures of those different parameters when we compare them to different criterion measurements. So really, they aren't suitable to be used in a lot of research applications. And then even depending on the clinical usage of these different devices, I think we have to be cautious about how we're utilizing some of the information collected from these devices, how we're recommending them to be used to patients or clients or participants. I think they could still hold value in terms of providing general indicators of, again, movement intensity, or kind of overall volume of activity throughout a 24-hour period, or even extrapolating that beyond one day and then looking at kind of week-to-week trends or even month-to-month trends. So I still think they can be used. We just have to be careful in recommending these to patients in terms of they can't necessarily be used in a way to give us exact measurements of heart rate or how many calories a person is burning from one day to the next. Rather, they can be used to look at trends in activity levels or intensities of effort, again, throughout those different trials. Because a lot of them do have fairly high levels of reliability, meaning they might be slightly off in terms of their accuracy, but at least they're consistently off on more of a day-to-day and kind of week-to-week trend. So we can still use them as a way to evaluate behavioral changes or overall movement trends, again, week to week or month to month, but we just have to be cautious of using them as an exact tool of exercise intensity or volume of effort, meaning we can't necessarily use this as a precise way to prescribe calories to a participant or patient if they're trying to lose weight. Again, knowing that there's that 20-30% error rate, we just wouldn't be able to use it as a exact measure, again, of calorie expenditure in those different situations. So some of the additional challenges and limitations of these fitness watches, a lot of them have proprietary algorithms that prevent us of knowing the exact parameters or information that's used to provide those estimates of either heart rate or energy expenditure or recovery or some of the other aspects that we collect from these different devices. There's a lot of motion artifacts, again, depending on the activity itself and the individual characteristics or demographics of the user. A lot of them aren't necessarily validated across all populations or specific activities. And then there's a lot of environmental influences that can, again, hinder our ability to use these as precise measurement tools as well. So I still think they hold value. I still think they can be used for general recommendations or a way to evaluate overall kind of measures of again, exercise intensity or volume of effort. But we just have to be a bit more cautious of using them in research applications or clinical applications, depending on the specific information that we're either interpreting or even using them from more of a prescription basis on the back end. So this is kind of a list of my references. Hopefully everyone found this information valuable, and hopefully now we know kind of how these devices can be used in practice moving forward.